My family kicked me out of their home, leaving me on the street with no future. But 10 years later, I returned and bought their entire village. No one could have imagined that someone they considered weak and useless would be able to completely change their lives and show them who was boss. Now the village is under my control. My family is dealing with the consequences of their past decisions, and the entire village is witnessing justice being restored. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. As a child, I didn't feel like I had a family. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew everyone and it seemed like everyone had a strong social network of relatives, friends, or neighbors. But my situation was completely different. After my mother died when I was 14, my father quickly remarried, and that was the end of my life at home. My father's new wife treated me like an outsider from day one. Her entire family was constantly visiting, and every visit ended with me being humiliated, my shortcomings pointed out, and jokes about how no one needed me. I tried to endure it, hoping my father would intercede, but he remained silent. Then one day he told me point blank that I was getting in the way of him building a new life. It sounded like I was some kind of burden that needed to be gotten rid of. So, at 17, I ended up on the streets. Literally. I had only a backpack, a few clothes, and some money that I had managed to save up through part-time jobs. I stayed overnight at friends' houses, then found a cheap room in a college dorm where I was finally accepted thanks to my good grades. Life was tough. I had to work nights at a diner to pay for food and shelter. Sometimes I fell asleep during classes, but there was no other option. I constantly thought about how I got kicked out, and it became my motivator. I promised myself that I would never allow myself to be treated like that again. In college, I became fascinated with programming. I loved understanding code, finding solutions, and pretty quickly I started taking on small projects. At first, these were simple websites for local businesses, then more serious projects. By the age of 22, I had built a sufficient portfolio and decided to take a risk, moving to Chicago and trying my hand at a large company. Moving was the hardest decision of my life. I had no one in the big city, no support, but I felt that if I stayed where I was, I would never achieve anything more. I got a job at a small company that didn't pay much, but I gained a lot of experience. I worked nights, learned new technologies, and gradually realized I could start my own business. I wanted to prove to myself and the world that I wasn't some kid who could be kicked out of the house like an unwanted possession. At first, I created a small startup with two guys I met at a conference. We lived in a rented apartment that was both a bedroom and an office. We barely had enough money for food and rent, but we were incredibly driven. A year later, we managed to find an investor. That was a turning point. From that moment on, my life began to change. The company grew, we signed new contracts, and for the first time, I felt like I had more than just a job, but a life's work. I was 25 when I bought my first apartment. That was the first time I thought about my family, not because I missed them. Rather, because I realized that they considered me a failure while I had managed to get back on my feet. I knew that sooner or later I would return to that village, but I would return a different person. 10 years had passed since I was kicked out. During that time, I had risen so high that my business was bringing in millions. I began investing in real estate, buying old buildings, restoring them, and renting them out. One day, I came across a project in my home state. The entire village was for sale, or rather, almost all the houses and land, because many people were leaving for the cities, and those who remained were barely making ends meet. I stared at the papers for a long time and realized that fate was giving me an opportunity. By buying this village, I would not only make a profit but also close the old gestalt. I agreed without hesitation. The deal took several months, but when I signed the documents and became the official owner, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I was there for the first time in many years. Almost nothing had changed. The same streets, the same houses, only they had become even more dilapidated. People looked at me warily. Many didn't even recognize me, but I remembered every face, especially those who had participated in kicking me out. My family still lived there. My father and his wife, her relatives. I saw them leaving the house, and my stomach twisted. I knew then that I'd deal with them first. When news began to spread that the village was now mine, I realized that this was precisely what had shocked people the most. In a small place, rumors travel faster than the wind, and within a couple of days, I was the talk of every kitchen. Many didn't recognize me right away, because more than 10 years had passed. I had changed. I looked different. I dressed completely differently from what they were used to seeing as a teenager who'd once been thrown out of the house. But as soon as word reached the first neighbors, everything fell into place. Those who remembered the boy I'd left the village as now couldn't believe that I'd returned as the owner of their land and houses. The tension was palpable in the streets. People stopped, whispered, and tried to sneak a peek at me. Some looked with curiosity, others with outright envy, and still others with hostility, because they understood that change was inevitable. They were especially animated in their discussions of my family. After all, they were the ones who had once thrown me out. Now everyone knew they would be the first to be hit, and this excited the village more than any news. In small towns and villages, other people's misfortunes always become a source of entertainment for neighbors. When I first walked into the local store, conversation died down immediately. People pretended to be busy shopping, but I saw everyone glance at me. I put a couple of bottles of water on the register, handed over my card, and the girl behind the counter finally couldn't stand it. She looked at me carefully and asked if it was true that the entire village now belonged to me. I nodded, and a quiet murmur rolled through the room. Several people turned away, others froze, as if waiting for me to say something else. I said nothing more, simply picked up the bag and left. Several men were already standing outside, exchanging glances, and one of them, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from my father, muttered, "Well, we've waited long enough, now we'll be walking under it." I pretended not to hear, but inside I was seething. In the evenings, the village began to live its own life. People gathered at the gate, discussing the news, and I was sure my steps and plans were being scrutinized down to the last detail. I caught snatches of conversation. Some hoped I'd invest money and revitalize the village. Others laughed and said I'd come here for revenge and would kick out everyone I didn't like. But the main topic of discussion was what would happen to my father and his new family. Many were expecting a spectacle, remembering how I'd been kicked out and now wanted to see the opposite. On the 3rd day after my arrival, an old man, a former neighbor down the street, approached me. He always kept to himself, never meddling in other people's affairs. He looked at me for a long time, then said he was glad I'd made it in life, and that now many would try to curry favor with me. He warned me not to trust a word he said, because everyone here would only think about their own gain. I thanked him, but I knew it myself. The longer I spent in the village, the clearer it became that this atmosphere of gossip and chatter was weighing on me more than I'd expected. My relatives remained silent for now, though I knew they were aware of everything. They didn't come out to see me, didn't seek me out. I saw my father pass through the yard several times, but he pretended to be busy, just to avoid making eye contact. His wife hid behind the curtains, and her relatives generally tried to stay out of sight. But the neighbors never missed a chance to start a conversation. Some started with stock phrases, reminiscing about knowing me as a child and how they'd always seen me as a hard worker. Others spoke bluntly, "You're the boss now, and it all depends on you what happens to us." They wanted to know what my plans were, whether the houses would be torn down, whether rent would rise, who would be able to stay, and who would lose their roof over their heads. I was in no hurry to answer. I looked into their eyes and saw the fear they tried to hide behind curiosity. They thought they were still in control, but in reality, power had long since passed to me. Every evening, the conversations in the village grew louder. Some insisted that I would simply invest in the land and leave, leaving them alone. Others argued that I'd bought the village specifically for revenge and would start evicting everyone who had ever crossed me. Still others whispered that I'd rise even higher, sell the village, and throw out the people without a second thought. The more I heard this gossip, the more I became convinced of my decision. I hadn't come to reassure them. I'd come to set the record straight, and I intended to start with those who had once thrown me out, but I decided to wait a little longer. Let the rumors heat up the atmosphere, let people exhaust themselves with speculation. Let them dread every evening that tomorrow someone would knock on their door. This game of nerves was new to me, but I felt it was only gaining momentum. The village, where I'd once been a nobody, now lived in anticipation of my decisions, and this thought filled me with strength. I didn't immediately go to my father and his family. For several days, I watched how they behaved in the house, how they tried to act cautiously, how they glanced toward the street every time, as if expecting me to appear. All those days I was plotting, but most of all, I was interested in who would dare approach me first. After 4 days, My father, his wife, and the others weren't satisfied with the whispers and sidelong glances. First, my father showed up. He stood at the gate of the house, his eyes downcast, trying to appear confident, but I could tell he was tense inside. His wife held herself with haughty grace, but her fingers on the steering wheel trembled as she tried to hide her nervousness. My father tried to initiate the conversation. "Since you're back, let's talk. Everything can be sorted out, a compromise found." I simply watched him silently, observing every emotion, every attempt to hide his fear. He took steps forward, then slowed, as if hesitant to continue, and at some point asked if I really intended to hurt them. I responded with a simple look and a phrase that sounded cold. All the decisions had already been made. Silence hung over the courtyard. His wife, usually the most assertive, got into the car and pretended to leave, but my father asked her to stay. She looked at me with eyes that expressed both irritation and anxiety, trying to find the words to justify herself, to explain. They started talking about the past, how they were young then, unsure of what to do, how they'd done it all without malice, how I'd grown up, and I probably already understood that life had turned out differently. I listened and realized it was just an attempt at manipulation. None of them wanted to admit that they'd kicked me out deliberately, that they'd left a teenager on the street without money or hope. My father tried to appeal to pity, saying he'd always wanted me to be happy, but I saw right through it. His desire was to preserve his own comfort, not to care for me. Then I calmly told them that no amount of excuses would bring back the years I'd spent struggling to survive, and that everything they'd done back then had consequences. Their faces changed before my eyes, fear, surprise, an attempt to dissuade anger. They understood that this whole game of waiting for my decision was over, and now I held the power. They began to beg, plead, tried to offer money, a house, any conditions just to stay in their apartments. My father tried to act brave, saying that if I acted like that, the village would split and people would be against me. But I knew these were empty words. None of them understood that I was truly in power now. My stepmother wept quietly, hiding her face in her hands, but this didn't evoke sympathy in me, only a cold sense of justice. She tried to remind me that we were related, that there was a blood connection, that I should show leniency. I said that this connection was irrelevant, that blood doesn't make a person better, and that justice is measured by actions, not words. They began to lose their composure. The relatives quarreled among themselves, tried to shout over each other, blaming each other for being in this situation together. No one wanted to take responsibility. My father tried to defend his wife, but I saw that he himself no longer knew what to say. I calmly explained that the first step would be the harshest. They would have to leave their homes, and that I would not compromise. My words were firm and peremptory. Then they began to appeal to my pity, talking about the children, the neighbors, how they would be kicked out and things would get worse. I replied that this was precisely the consequence of their actions 10 years ago, that now everything had been settled fairly. Every word they said, every attempt to persuade me, only strengthened my feeling that I had made the right choice. I saw their fear grow with each passing minute. They began to ask for more time, even though they knew delay would not change the situation. I told them they could wait as long as they wanted, but the decision had already been made, and every day of delay only postponed the inevitable. At that moment, through the open windows, I heard the whispers of the neighbors who had already gathered near their houses, discussing everything that was happening, sharing their guesses about who would be able to stay and who would be the first to leave. The atmosphere of tension grew tense because everyone understood. This was personal revenge, long-awaited justice for the past, and now the entire village was watching to see who would be next. My family tried to find a way out. Calls to friends and relatives, promises of help, threats, attempts to negotiate through intermediaries. But I remained steadfast. Every day I saw them change. Some lost confidence, others grew panicky, some began to get angry and look for someone to blame. I saw my words having the desired effect. They were beginning to understand that the consequences of the past were real and inevitable. The neighbors secretly watched everything, whispering, sharing impressions, discussing who would be the first to leave, who would try to negotiate. There was a sense of a gathering storm in the air. The family that had once thrown me out on the street with impunity now stood on the brink of losing everything that mattered. I understood that their every move was now being calculated by me, that I was observing and guiding their reactions, and that justice was finally beginning to take shape. The eviction began in the morning. I arrived at my father's house just as he was getting ready for breakfast. His wife stood by the window, trying to hide her tears, and my father clenched his fists and looked as if he were trying to muster his will. Neighbors had already begun to gather by the road and on the sidewalk, exchanging glances and whispering to each other. Everyone understood that this would not be just a formality, that a real scene was about to unfold, watched by the entire village. I got out of the car, calmly approached the gate, placed my hand on the wicket, and felt the tension around me increase. My father stepped forward, about to say something, but I cut him off with a look. The silence immediately became louder than any words. Several neighbors started taking photos and videos on their phones, whispering that this is a historic moment, and each of them waited to see which of their relatives would break first. I explained to my father and his wife that the eviction process was non-negotiable. It was a legal action, and they had time to pack their things and leave the house. My stepmother began sobbing, trying to grab the doorframe, begging me to wait, saying they could negotiate, pay, and fulfill any conditions. I said there could be no conditions, that these were the consequences of their past decisions, and that the power was now in my hands. My father tried to act dignified, but I could see the panic growing within him. He tried to talk about how things would be bad for the neighbors, that the community would fall apart, that people would judge me. I looked at the street where the neighbors were standing and said that it was precisely the observation of the entire community that made justice complete. Now everyone could see that consequences can be real. The relatives began packing. At first, it was slow, almost instinctive, trying to stall the situation, looking for loopholes, asking the neighbors to intervene. The neighbors stood there, whispering, some quietly supporting their relatives, some gloating, some simply watching tensely. An hour later, my stepmother tried to start a fight, accusing me of being too cruel, accusing something that could have been resolved peacefully. I stood next to the door, coldly explaining that they could have resolved this peacefully 10 years ago when they kicked me out, and that now it was too late to talk about a peaceful solution. My father, seeing his wife losing control, tried to calm her, but his voice was shaking. He knew it was the end and that arguing was pointless. The neighbors watched closely to see which of the relatives gave in first. After a while, my stepmother sat on the porch, covering her face with her hands. My father stood nearby, clutching his chin, as if trying to contain his emotions, but his hands were shaking. The family tried to find last-minute excuses, talking about their children, their neighbors, how they wouldn't be able to move anywhere, about their long family history, about the difficulties. I watched silently, registering their every move, realizing that the psychological component was now working in my favor. Fear, confusion, the realization of my own helplessness. The neighbors began discussing among themselves who would remain in the village, who would be able to rent houses, who, like the family, would be at risk. The atmosphere grew tense, but I didn't intervene. They needed to see the consequences with their own eyes. The family began loading the trucks. My father tried to hold on to the furniture, but I gently but firmly explained that everything had to be cleared out now. My stepmother tried to approach me several times, begging for more time, but I repeated. The decision was final, no discussion. 3 hours later, the houses were empty. The family had left, leaving behind a void and a sense of defeat. The neighbors stood, quietly exchanging glances. Some whispered, "Now there's justice." Some shook their heads, and still others quietly discussed how they'd have to get used to the new rules. I looked around at the empty houses and realized that I could now truly rule the village. Not out of anger, but as a demonstration that decisions have consequences, that the past is returning. The streets of the village were silent. People watched as I calmly walked between the houses, taking notes, recording which neighbors could stay and which would be under my control. Some approached me and began to say they supported the decision, that they'd seen how my family had treated me in the past, and that now everything was back to normal. Others remained silent, watching tensely, trying to discern how events would unfold. I felt the power of the moment. 10 years ago, I was a nobody, kicked out of my house and the village, and now the entire village was literally subject to my gaze, my will. But at the same time, I understood that power comes with responsibility. I saw my neighbors assessing me, some trying to hide their anxiety, others trying to understand what would change in their lives. Their relatives had left, but the memory of their fear and panic lingered with every step, every glance. People whispered about who would be next under surveillance, who could stay, who would leave. But that day, the village realized, the past has consequences and justice can be merciless. I stood on the empty street, looking at the houses that had once seemed alien, now completely under my control. The neighbors gradually dispersed, but each understood that this day would go down in the history of the village. For me, this day symbolized the closure of old wounds, a symbol that years of struggle, work, and patience had not been in vain, and that now my life and my decisions determined the order here. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and tension, understanding that now I had to act wisely to ensure the village began to live by new rules. But the effect of fear and respect I saw in the eyes of my relatives and neighbors would remain with them for a long time. After my relatives left the village, the first hours and days were a real shock for them. They couldn't believe that this had actually happened, that the man they had once thrown out onto the street now determined their fate. My father sat in the rented apartment, clutching his chin in his hands, silently staring at the wall. He tried to understand how it was possible that the boy he once considered a burden had become the master of the entire village, and that his own life had now been completely changed. His stepmother, who always tried to appear strong and powerful, couldn't hide her tears. She paced the apartment several times, clutching at the furniture as if trying to find support, but she realized there was none left. A feeling of humiliation grew within her. All these years she had considered herself superior, stronger, smarter, and now she had been completely deprived of control. The relatives began to blame each other. Some said it was their father's fault, that he had allowed him to grow up, develop his abilities, and create an empire, only to return and punish them. Others blamed the stepmother for interfering too much in his life, causing him to leave and then return with such influence. Gradually, all the conversations boiled down to one thing: who would be responsible for their own fate and how to live from now on. They began planning where to move, what apartments to rent, whom to ask for help. Every time someone offered a temporary solution, another responded that it was too little, that they had now lost what they considered theirs. A sense of panic set in. The family couldn't believe their familiar life had been destroyed. Every day began with questions like, what if he comes back? What if he decides to sell our houses? Where will we live? These questions haunted them. They never imagined that someone they considered a nobody would return with such power and be able to completely change their destinies. The neighbors weren't immune either. They knew what had happened and occasionally met with their former relatives to discuss it. Some quietly whispered that they brought this on themselves. Others expressed sympathy, but even those who tried to support them understood that their relatives had now lost their influence and status in the village. The family gradually realized that their every move was now under surveillance. Even when they tried to discuss plans for the future, the feeling remained that their lives had changed forever, that they were no longer masters, but people whose decisions would be determined by circumstances created by the formerly exiled boy. Gradually, fear gave way to irritation and anger. They understood that what had happened was unfair, in their own minds, although objectively it was retribution for the past. The father tried several times to gather the family together to discuss what to do next, but each meeting degenerated into a quarrel. The stepmother accused him of underestimating her son, and other relatives accused each other of interfering too much in the lives of others. It became clear that unity was no longer possible. Panic and anger combined with confusion. They didn't know where to go, how to organize their lives, how to regain any kind of control. Some of them tried to find work closer to the village, hoping to control the situation at least from afar. Others considered selling their new apartments, but each attempt seemed pointless because the thought of having completely lost their influence haunted them. Moments of despair began to arise within the family. The stepmother couldn't sleep at night. The father paced the apartment and replayed the events, repeating the same thing over and over. How did this happen? Why did he come back like this? How could we not have foreseen this? The family began to understand that years of self-assurance and control over other people's lives had backfired. Every day, they faced consequences they had never imagined. Empty houses, disapproving glances from neighbors, humiliation in front of acquaintances, and a sense of complete loss of power. Gradually, new emotions began to emerge: envy, bitterness, a sense of betrayal, even if no actual betrayal had occurred. They themselves had created a situation in which the former boy could gain the upper hand, and now all the consequences fell entirely on their shoulders. The family tried to turn to acquaintances for advice and support, but most people in the village knew this was punishment for their past, and their advice boiled down to one thing: accept reality. No one could offer them a way to regain control. And the more they tried to act, the more they realized that power had now completely passed to the hero, who had been exiled 10 years earlier, and was now the master of their lives and the village. Fear gradually gave way to a sense of hopelessness. Every morning, the family woke up with the thought that events could no longer be changed, that their former lives were destroyed, and that they would now have to rebuild their existence from scratch. For the first time, they felt that their usual confidence, which they had taken for granted, was an illusion, and that those years when they could control the fate of another person now returned to them in full force, but in the form of punishment and the loss of their familiar world. This experience taught them a lesson, both painful and profound. Never underestimate someone you've once wronged, and the consequences of your own decisions can catch up with you at the most unexpected moment. After my family finally left the village, I allowed myself to stop and look around for the first time in a way I never had before. The houses, the streets, the empty yards, everything looked different than it had in childhood, yet at the same time felt familiar. I walked down a street where every stone had once marked my childhood steps and felt a mixture of wonder and inner satisfaction. This village, once a symbol of humiliation and pain, was now mine, but not just as property, as a symbol that long years of struggle, patience, and labor had not been in vain. The neighbors were gradually recovering from the events of the last few days. Many came up to exchange glances or quietly discuss what had happened. Some were amazed that I had managed to achieve this, others quietly approved, a few were envious, but they all understood one thing: a new reality had emerged here, and it was completely under my control. I began to record who in the village was willing to cooperate, who was trustworthy, and who was not. These observations were important because I understood that a village wasn't just a collection of houses and land. It was people, their habits, their relationships, and for everything to be stable, it was necessary to act wisely. My relatives remained distant, but I saw the consequences of their actions. My father called several times, tried to intervene, discussed options, but my responses were cold and curt. The past cannot be undone, and the power was now mine. My stepmother tried to reach out through mutual acquaintances, promising to pay, bribe, and ask them to leave their homes, but no one could change their minds. Each of their actions only increased their inner satisfaction, the knowledge that justice, albeit a long road, had been restored. The neighbors were beginning to get used to the new rules. I decided to gradually implement changes. I checked the condition of the houses, made repairs where necessary, met with local entrepreneurs, and discussed ways to improve life in the village without creating a pretext for conflict. But at the same time, he made it clear that no one could disturb the order or try to regain influence through words or threats. This balance between justice and control became an essential part of my new life. My relatives, however, were experiencing their own consequences. First, panic and despair, then irritation and anger at themselves. They understood that their familiar lives had been destroyed and that they would never be able to regain what they had lost due to their own decisions. Occasionally, I heard rumors of my father and stepmother arguing, blaming each other, seeking justification, but no argument changed the fact. Power had passed to me, and their past had now become their own trap. I observed this from afar and understood that inner satisfaction lay not in revenge per se, but in the fact that justice had been restored, and the lesson they had learned was visible to me through their actions and reactions. With each passing day, I increasingly felt that the village was becoming mine, not in the sense of personal wealth, but as a territory where order was determined by honesty and responsibility. I saw people who had once simply observed events begin to get involved, some coming with ideas for improvement, others cautiously proposing collaboration. My relatives, however, had completely faded from my life, and their influence on the village had vanished. Occasionally, a neighbor would mention them in conversation, discussing their condition and plans, but everyone understood that this was history, and they no longer had the power to interfere. I began making decisions that felt fair and reasonable. I supported those who worked honestly, created conditions for the development of the village, but at the same time, maintained a sense that the past could not be ignored. Every step I took gave me a sense of inner victory, because everything was achieved through honest work, not simply out of anger or a desire for revenge. In the evenings, when the streets were empty, I often went for a walk, looked at the houses, the road along which my father and stepmother had once walked, the places where I played as a child, and realized that history had come full circle. I no longer felt resentment, no longer had the desire for revenge. Instead, a feeling of complete control and inner peace emerged. The family that had once seemed untouchable now became an example of how decisions come back to haunt you, and how consequences can be harsh but fair. I understood that this village was a symbol of my life, a symbol of how a person once considered weak and unnecessary can grow up, take responsibility, and restore justice. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that I could now live the way I wanted, and that the past, though it had left its scars, no longer controlled my life. My neighbors gradually adjusted, the village came alive, and my relatives remained far away, but with the knowledge that their mistakes would forever remain part of their own history. This ending was not just a victory over the past, but a symbol of how patience, hard work, and the ability to act decisively can restore justice and give a person the ability to control their own life. And now, with the village under my control, with my family now just a memory, I felt for the first time that I could live peacefully without looking back, and that the lesson life had taught me had been fully learned.